Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. In this video, we're going to have a look at an overview of Serverless 360. So the sort of elevator pitch for Serverless 360 is that it's a management and monitoring tool aimed at freeing up the resource who are your developers and Azure experts who end up spending a lot of time supporting the solution. We want them to focus on development of new stuff, and we want to be able to let your support team and your business users participate in the operations of a solution. So here we see an example where a typical support scenario results in support tickets going to IT. The business users have no visibility of the solution, couldn't do anything. The Azure portal is too challenging for the level 1 support person. For level 2, limited experience, and the complexity of Azure makes it difficult to do anything. So all of these tickets end up going to your Azure experts and your developers who have to do the management. So the more solutions you build, the more this support burden slows you down, makes it difficult to deliver new value. And eventually you just run out of capacity in your team because you're doing so much support. So the aim of Serverless 360 is to address this problem. The way we're going to do that is we have 4 modules within Serverless 360. So first up over here, we've got business applications, and business applications is targeted at the operations of the resources that you have in Azure. So we aim to make it easier to manage those resources, easier to set up monitoring, easier to do the day-to-day tasks that you need to do. That'll help your support teams who aren't experts in Azure be able to support more of the solution than they do now. Next up, we've got business activity monitoring. So this is aimed more at integration type scenarios or business process scenarios. So in addition to managing the physical resources on Azure, so you may manage a web app, a logic app, a function, or whatever else it is that you're monitoring, there's a higher abstraction here as well. So instead of just monitoring the component, we want to monitor the business transactions. So business activity monitoring will let you visualize, manage, and monitor things like the processing of an order, regardless of how it's implemented. The target's to manage the order. And that's where we think we can help by getting the business super users to self-service the solutions they build, letting the level 1 and 2 support people do more because they can manage the order process and spend less time managing things like a logic app, a function, a data factory, etc. Next up, we've got cost analyzer. So cost analyzer is about trying to build a cost-focused culture in your organization. So we find that a lot of companies treat cost where nobody really looks at it until there's a big bill, and then there's a problem, and there's a lot of time spent troubleshooting. Where did that money go? Why did we get into this situation with this unexpected bill? We want to spin that round, and the idea is to give visibility of the cost data so that teams can all participate and think about cost from the minute you start developing the solution, and ideally even before that, but we can keep on top and have visibility of it, and that'll get us to a culture where we're being efficient and spending money effectively. Finally, we've got Azure Documenter. So Document is about generation of documentation. So teams spend a lot of time writing documentation, and also we have to produce documentation to meet audit requirements and to produce management reports to show we're applying good governance. So all of that takes time from your experienced people to keep on top of it. So if we can generate documentation that meets your requirements, that'll free your team up to work on delivering more value to the business. So when we implement these modules, the idea is that we start shifting support left, so that Azure expert and developers over on the right over here, who previously they were spending a lot of their time doing support, especially the more you built Azure-based solutions. So we've got this support heading left. We've got the business super users able to do self-service of order processes and that kind of thing in business activity monitoring. So this is meant to represent the BAM tool here. We've then got proactive monitoring, proactive management of the solution using business applications, and that will help your level 1 and level 2 support people be able to to do more and provide more services to managing the day-to-day operations of your solution. That frees up people on the left to build more solutions, delivering more value to the business. So let's think about an example sort of implementation here. So we're going to take an integration example in this case to show how Serverless 360 would fit into the solution. So let's take a requirement where we've got a finance team who use SAP. SAP publishes iDocs to an integration platform built on Azure. We need to process these iDocs, and we're going to implement a publish subscribe pattern that'll pub sub iDocs that come out of SAP to support different interfaces. In this case, we're going to give the example of implementing order processing for MapMass and order iDocs into Maximo, which is a system from IBM. So this diagram shows what this would look like. It's a very common type of integration scenario. So we've got the iDocs getting published here to an interface. So each of these green boxes represents an interface. And then we've got the one for dealing with the order message and one for dealing with the material message. They both integrate into Maximo. Now, the likelihood is in the real world, a customer is going to be building more interfaces to other systems. That'll grow over time as you develop more solutions, and you'll have other interfaces going back the other way. So you might start off with one simple scenario, but over time you're going to build more and more solutions. So getting this monitoring and management right, especially at the start, will help you as you grow. If we think about how we might implement the example from the previous slide, so let's say here we've got a logic app that is in our iDoc publishing interface that listens to SAP, and then as iDocs get published, they hit that logic app. We publish them onto Service Bus, which allows us to implement this pub sub pattern. So we can route messages, maybe with basic bit on the type of iDoc that came out, and we can send the order one to the order interface and the material one to the material. Now, for processing the iDoc, our topic would route the message to this queue. We'd have a logic app that would listen to the message, and we might integrate into Maximo. If it's got an HTTP-based API, we can use API management to proxy that to give us some centralized management, and we can integrate fairly easily. So, in this scenario, we're introducing logic apps, Service Bus, API management. Now, with Serverless 360, it could be any kind of resource in Azure. In this case, we're just using these to illustrate how we would build up our applications. Now, let's jump into business apps first. This is the day-to-day management of your solutions. So, business apps is about how can we give features that make it easier for your level 1 and 2 support people to do this day-to-day operations. So we're looking at creating a structure where people can solve this problem. So in the deployment on Azure, you've got things all over the place in different resource groups and different subscriptions, and they may work together to solve a problem like we saw in the last slide, but they're deployed in different places, and that level 1 and 2 support people aren't going to understand that deployment model because it's not something they'd be dealing with day to day. So with a business application, we're able to group the resources that work together into a management container so we can act on them as if they're, from that management and operations perspective. We then would provide advanced tooling, so we can do things like managing queues, resuming logic apps. We can have other features that the Azure portal doesn't have, such as our action required feature on a logic app, which we'll look at in a second. And we build features aimed at helping that support person. We can then do automation of repetitive tasks. So if you've got a common task such as resubmitting dead letter queues, we can set up jobs to do that for you. And we can create visualizations, so when your monitoring's configured, you can see easily a heat zone into where the problem is, and by looking at our tree view to work out which app's having a problem, and look at the service map to see where in that app we've got the problem. So if we think about the example architecture we've looked at so far, in this case, these here are two business applications I've chosen to set up. So one of them over here is focused on This one here is focused on my iDoc publisher, so I may build a business app, put the logic app and the topic into it, and I'll treat them as one management unit because that particular widget might be used by multiple other interfaces, so it makes sense to manage it together. Now, with my second business app, I decided to put the load order and the load material together. Now, I could have had them separate if I wanted to. This is where you make the choices based on what makes the most sense for how you want to manage your solution. So I've basically got a business app that manages interfaces that load data into Maximo, and I can add these, the queue, the service bus, the APIs that I need, add them to this business app and manage them as a group. Now, what that would look like is, here's a screenshot from Serverless 360. So one of our first features customers really like is this tree view over here. So instead of having resources scattered in resource groups and subscriptions and you can't visualize what they look like, the tree view allows you to model what makes sense for your business. So here, for example, I've got Kovi as the root, and then I've got my customer facing apps, my data platform, my integration area. So you can start building maybe things like departmental resource applications, or maybe you've got subsidiaries. You can have note folders for different subsidiaries. But in this case, in my integration area, I've got a couple of different things I've done. So my platform would be where I would put common services, so I can manage things like service bus namespaces, API management in namespaces in there, and they would be reused by multiple different interfaces. And then I've got my integration apps folder here, where I'm going to start putting the functional applications that make sense for how the different interfaces that we build for the business. So here I've got finance ones, HR, IT, and the one that we looked at previously is this one just here. So we've got the business app for iDoc publishing and the business application for the Maximo subscribers. So what I've done here in the Maximo one, which I've got highlighted, I've added all of the resources, and then over here you've got the service map view. So what I've been able to do here is I can, so firstly, when you add resources to your business app, we'll automatically start trying to monitor them based on things like a profile. So you would have a system out of the box profile with common counters set up, and you can also build your own profiles. But the minute you add a resource, we'll attempt to start monitoring it just from the fact that you've added it. And then what you can do here is we'll try to auto-generate a service map, and then you can modify it to look like whatever you want. So we can work out some of the relationships, but sometimes you might want to modify it. And here I did, so I can make it look like the diagram on the previous slide. So here I've got my orders interface and my material one. See, we've got our service bus subscription logic app, and I've got one operation from an API for that interface. So that, maybe that API has 50 operations on it for Maximo for different things, but I only need one for this interface. Now, what I'm seeing here is when I look at these shapes, the fact that they're green tells me that they're healthy, and I could click on it, open it out and see some counters, and it would show me what I'm monitoring and what their state is. And if for example, I had an error scenario, I would get a notification if I've configured a notification channel. I would come in to look in Serverless 360. So over in the tree view, I would see the node would light up red down the tree, so I'd be able to see where I've got a problem. And then on my service map, I would, let's say this logic app's the problem, so I would see this go red. I could click on it and it would bring up the metrics that were reporting problems. Now, these resources, they can be monitored based on things like metrics available on the Azure API. We've got things like for the API here, you can configure queries against app insights as well as metrics. So you could be able to have a custom query of some kind that you want to monitor. We can monitor things like log analytics and app insights data. We've got API endpoint monitors if you want to ping something and check if it's available. So there's a number of different ways monitoring can be configured. But this is the first view where we think a lot of customers really like Serverless 360 because it creates this holistic view of your estate that's easy to understand and easy to manage. Next up, we've got individual resources. So you'll see over here in my Maximo application, here's some of the resources here that I've added to the app. So that, we just open the tree view out, and here I've got one of the logic apps, and this shows where we start adding features to Serverless 360 that the Azure portal doesn't offer. So things like run history and trigger history, they also exist in the Azure portal. So here we're just trying to make it easy for the support person to come in. They can come in this app and they can see the runs for your logic app, and you can click one and see that history. But one of the things that the Azure portal doesn't have is this action required tab, and we think this is a pretty important feature. So the idea here is that when I run my logic apps, I might have 10 that errored and 90 that was successful. So I'd go and resume some of them and then try again, and maybe I do 5 of them, but I've still got 10 errors that show up in the Azure portal, and I've got 5 new success ones, but you can't really correlate which ones you've actually reprocessed and which ones you decided I can ignore that because the problem was fixed somewhere else, so maybe someone corrected the data in a system and you don't need to replay it. So you need a to-do list of what things do we need to sort out of these 10 errors. 5 of them we fixed, 5 we still need to do. And that kind of features where the action required tab comes in. This is my to-do list, so I can choose one, I can resubmit it, and then it'll go away from this list, or I can choose one and decide to ignore it. It'll let me put a comment, give me a reason why I've ignored it, and it'll go away from the list as well. And the idea here is to just add these features for specific types of Azure resources where we're filling the gaps that Azure has. So if you imagine the Azure portal might get you 60-70% of the way there from a support perspective, but a lot of customers recognize that it's built to help app developers build apps. It's not necessarily focused on how do you support them in the real world, and that's where Serverless 360 tries to fill that 30-40% gap with features that people need in the real world. And also remembering that a lot of these features come from our own applications that we've developed. So Kovi has another bunch of apps like Churn 360, Document 360, where we're offering SaaS applications that we need to run, and Serverless 360's got features that we use to run our own applications. So the idea here is this is where the business applications have let us move some of this support left. So we've got these support operators down here who can now do more. They get told when there's problems by the system. They can easily check if there's, what the problem is, figure out where it might be impacted in your application landscape. And then there's some tooling to help you fix some of these problems. And that's step one in shifting support left. Next up, let's look at business activity monitoring. So here we're looking at this higher abstraction. Instead of managing a web app, managing a function, or managing a logic app, we want to manage a business process. So the idea here is if we can send telemetry data from our solution to the business activity monitoring API, we can then light up a whole bunch of features such as being able to track and trace and manage transactions so that you can make it much easier to see that distributed tracing scenario. And then you get features like repair and resubmit and that kind of thing, and we can build dashboards and stuff. So we're trying to shift support further left past the developer, ideally past the level 1 and 2 support people, and allow business super users to do self-service, which we think is a really popular thing. So the idea is instead of a business user going, well, we know our business partner sent us the data today, we've got 20 orders, but we don't really know what happened with them. So they raise a support ticket, and then it gets escalated, and the developer looks at it. The business super user can go and look at BAM and see that we received the message. We can see that some of them got processed, and maybe there's 2 or 3 orders had a problem. They can then see what the problem was if you choose to let them, and they might even be able to fix the problem for themselves. So let's say the most common 2 scenarios we find in these sort of error scenarios are going to be either the target system was down, or there was some data issue where they would need to fix the data in the source system or in the destination system and resubmit the message. We think that those two types of error handling can actually fix most of the problems that people get in the real world. So if we can let the business self-service that, that can reduce a significant number of support tickets. So we're trying to empower business users here. We're trying to show complex transactions in a way that, if you think of a logic app, for example, you might have 100 or 200 shapes in a logic app. If we can represent that in a way that's much easier for people to understand without being a logic app expert, that makes it easier to track and trace and troubleshoot. We can then also have out-of-the-box monitoring and troubleshooting and resubmission features. So if we think about the solution we had previously, so what we're doing this time is we're now going to instrument our logic app. So we'd add a shape to the logic app where we would say, here's the start of a transaction, here's an update to what happened to that transaction. These events would get sent from different places to our BAM API, and that would start appearing on our BAM solution. Now, the data that you send can come from a logic app, it can come from Power Automate, Data Factory, Synapse, functions, custom code. There's many different ways. Basically anywhere you can make an API call from, you can send something about a transaction. So even if you're just using a console app for an old solution on a VM, you could still send that data to BAM if you chose to. You would have to implement some code modifications to do it, but you would be sending data that would light up our BAM capabilities. Now, here's an example of what you get if you implement calls to our BAM API. So firstly, again, this tree view concept we think customers love. So here I can model not just my IT landscape, but here's my business process landscape. So you might have transactions for different departments like finance. Suppose my playpen's a proof of concept area. So let's say IT, HR here. And the one we're going to look at today is this HR person sync. So here I've got the onboarding of employees. So if you think of a typical company, when you onboard an employee, you've got a number of things that have to happen. So you might have an HR system they get onboarded to. They then need to be added into Active Directory. You need them added to groups, activate mailboxes, integrate them into other systems so that things are set up for their first day. So a lot of the times companies have challenges with this kind of business process, and it's difficult to work out what steps have been completed. So here we've got some solutions that we have with logic apps and API management and stuff that are sending data to BAM. So here you can see I've got my first name, email and surname, etc. of a person. So let's say we've got Birch Paddle, who's got a slightly strange unusual name there, but Birch joins. We have a problem with him joining, so I could go and search for all of the transactions related to Birch. You can see we've got a couple of them here and here. So I'd be able to see the history of what transactions we've processed. We get an indicator over here if they were successful or if there was an error. And I could click one of them. It opens up a diagram. So this is a slightly simplified view of the diagram. It would appear kind of over here on the screen. But this has shown me the stages that have been completed. So I can see we received a message. We looked up if he was an existing user, looked up his manager, created the user. And these boxes would either be green, red, or amber, depending on whether they're in process, they're completed successfully, or they had an error. And you can, so say down here, I could click on this box, it would open it up, and it would tell me any metadata that your event sent with it. If you sent a message body, we can choose to let the user see that message body. So they might want to troubleshoot any problems. And this is where you can also configure reprocessing. So each of the shapes could have a target where if there was a message archived and you wanted to reprocess from a given step, we could push the data to a queue or a logic app, and that would replay that from there. there's a little bit of implementation detail on that, but the ability to have BAM send a data to an endpoint, have some action taken, so if you want to compensate or reprocess. We then have a bunch of features, again, like this logic app feature we looked at before, action required, we really like. So here's your to-do list of any errors that you've had that you haven't sorted out yet. They'll appear in your action required tab, so you can make sure everything's getting dealt with, which we think will be really popular for support managers. You can favorite transactions if you want to keep an eye on them and come back later, and you can pass transactions between different users if you want to kind of pass a support call to somebody else. We then have features like dashboards, and you've got designers for the transactions up here as well, and there's also a monitoring tab that's slightly off the side of the screen there. So the aim of BAM was to move this support left. So previously we were in the middle here from shift left, so we've moved away from the developer. We've shifted some of the support to level 1, level 2, and level 3 IT support. Now we're really looking at business super users and level 1. If we can let them sort of self-service checking what happened to an order, so say we've got order number 1 comes in, did we receive it, did it have an error? If a support ticket's raised, the IT person can go in and check what's happened with that transaction. We manage the transaction, not the component, and we think this will be really popular for especially people doing integration type scenarios. Okay, next up we've got Cost Analyzer. So Cost Analyzer is about developing a cost management focused culture. So we have a bunch of features here that open up when you pass your billing data to Serverless 360. So we'll look for hidden costs, and we'll give you features to be able to optimize cost. We'll let you build dashboards to make it easy to see where you're spending money. And one of the things here is that we're targeting FinOps and Azure experts with this. So there's really a problem here that most companies have in the real world, is that there's a disconnect. So people who have access to the billing data usually don't understand how the solution was built to know if that money was spent well. And people who design and build the solution often don't have access to the cost data to manage if they're spending their money efficiently. And this kind of disconnect means there's a culture problem in how we do management of our cost, where we nothing happens until we get the big bill. Then everybody panics, and we kind of try and troubleshoot. If we can start from day one thinking about cost and managing cost, hopefully we'll avoid getting into that negative place in the first place. So if we can start making it easy for Azure experts to see and manage how the money's being spent, the FinOps person can focus on the governance on top of it, so they can challenge teams to make sure they're demonstrating that they're spending their money well. They challenge them to make sure they're not getting unexpected costs. We can have budgeting, so we can have alerts based around if you're spending money. We can look for anomalies and that kind of thing. So what this would look like, again, we've got our little tree view over here, which we think, again, it's something that makes sense for companies. So we want to structure our cost into maybe different departments, different application teams, and you can have your teams focus on managing their data. So it's about democratizing cost data, so that as well as managing it centrally, you can also have teams manage their own costs. So we see this a lot in organizations where a team might be responsible for integration, but it's difficult for them to see what do we actually spend from our big Azure bill on integration. So here we've built some examples. Sorry, that line should be there. So we've built some nodes where I can look at the integration costs. So this node here would be looking at integration as a whole, and then I can break it down and look at API management cost. I've got some, under this apps bit, I've got some subnodes where I've looked at certain integration solutions. So I can say, the one we looked at before, HR onboarding, or the SAP iDocs, I can start looking at how much those solutions cost. And I can maybe even start thinking about cross-charging or something like that, where I can demonstrate those costs that different departments are using. So the idea is you have your node, you've configured what the cost criteria is, so which billing data would relate to these folders. And then here I've got an example of one of the one of the graphs you can have. So I've built a graph that's looking at my cost by resource for my integration platform, and you'll see I started getting this big spike here. So I actually had a little bit of a cost problem a few months ago that I did a blog post about. And what happened was Serverless 360 started sending me emails saying, "Oh, you're spending more than your daily budget." And I assumed it would be like, "Oh, it'll go away tomorrow. It's probably just some random, unexpected thing. Maybe I've got an interface demo working a bit harder than normal." But then suddenly, after a couple of days, I'm still getting this email saying, "Oh, you're spending more than you're expecting." So I came and had a look, and I was like, "Oh, I can see I've got a bit of a problem starting to happen here." So fortunately, I was aware of the problem very quickly from it starting to happen. It wasn't until the end of the month, or it wasn't until my subscription suspended or something like that. I'm just getting to be aware of the problem early. I then had a look at what the problem was. A couple of days later, I've built an automation. So in this case, I started getting charged for the SFTP on the storage account, which had previously been free. So I wrote an automation to turn it off when I'm not using it. And you can see I brought my cost back down, and I was well within my budget again. So that's an example of how you can use Cost Analyzer to help your team see problems in the money that you spend. It's very difficult to kind of drill down to that level on just the data you care about. With the Azure portal, I think it's much more difficult. So here's an example where I would have configured the monitoring in the tab here, and I would just set a budget up. We've also got the optimization tab, which is this one over here. So one of the things that I can do is I can look to optimize cost by either scaling down, turning off, scaling up, turning on resources, depending on the schedule I want. So you can absolutely write automation scripts for this. It takes time to do it. It needs a skill set to maintain it. And we find that a lot of companies just don't really invest the time in doing it. So what we want to do here is make it easy for people to configure optimizations. So what you would do is for one of your tree nodes over here, so in this case I'm looking at my data gateway. So my scenario is I've got data gateways for used for non-production environments that they're just used for testing. I can turn them off when we're not using them. So what I can do is I can configure my resources to be added to this schedule, and then here, rather than having to write a load of scripts, I just tick these boxes to say whether I want them turned on or turned off. So green means it's on, red means it's off. You can add other resources where you can scale them up or scale them down and that kind of thing. I think at the minute we've probably got support for about 8 different resource types, but we'll be adding lots more over the coming months to allow you to really tune how your environment wants to be built. We think there could be some really big cost savings in this, especially for non-production scenarios. But it's all about making it easy for customers to do this, especially if you're a customer where you may have a team who has a lot more to do than the number of people that you have available to do the things that the apps you're going to build, etc. So if we can make it easy to do these good things without having to have a DevOps engineer spending lots of time configuring scripts that you need to maintain, we think that that's going to be a win all round. Okay, Azure Documenter then. So Azure Documenter is focused around governance, around documentation, and around automation to take away some of these tasks that are low value but still need to be done to ensure good governance. So we're focused on Azure experts, on FinOps and CXO type people being the target for these reports. So what we want to do is have some simple setup reports that can be generated on a scheduled basis. So let's say, for example, you want a weekly change report. You want a report about the security compliance. You want a report about cost changes. So you can configure these reports, and we'll just generate them on an ongoing basis for you. You'll get a notification to tell you the report's available, and then you could go and check the report out, and you've got the history of previous reports to be able to see over a period of time if you're getting better or if you're getting worse and that kind of thing. So here's an example where We've got some reports set up over here. So I've got my resource audit, my security compliance report. You can choose to have these saved into your storage account, or you can save them into Serverless 360 SaaS storage. You can have them saved as PDFs, Word documents. You can customize the templates if you want to. You can see we've also got a couple of other features up here. So things like the security compliance report. You can see some details about some of the policies in here. And then we've also got a diagram section. So here we find that a lot of the times customers need a set of diagrams for their solutions that make it easy to communicate with different teams. So maybe your dev team, your architecture team, and your support team need to just keep a central diagram that lets them talk about the solution and visualize it. So what we can do here is I add a diagram. I can choose the resources that I want. So maybe I choose some resource groups, and then I can just drag these, add the resources to my diagram pane. I can arrange them how I want. I can put notes and I can put other shapes on. So here's an example of one of my interfaces. This one's just articulating what my integration platform looks like in terms of the capabilities it has. And you would just have a list here of all the diagrams that you've chosen to build. And we think this is just a simple, easy way to make diagrams easy to do. You can save them for communication between your various teams. Okay, so thanks very much for listening. This video was aimed at showing a little bit of time just to give you a quick overview of why Serverless 360 we think is important to help you address the support and the solutions that you develop with Microsoft Azure. Hopefully you've had a little bit of a taster there of some of the great features that we have. We've got loads of videos on YouTube. We'll be adding more about different features where we'll deep dive. We'd love to, if you want to learn a bit more about it, come and chat to us. We'd love to give you a bit of a demo. We can dig deeper into certain things. You can tell us about the solutions that you're building, and we'll tell you about how the tool can help. Thanks very much for listening, and we hope to hear feedback on what kind of things you would like to see in our future videos. Thanks.